Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. My name's Steve Burgess, and I'm broadcasting from my home in Utah.
I'm David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in Ontario. You can catch us at fundamentalfreedoms.org. It's a website we've recently put up. You can find some really nice articles that Steve has been authoring. Please do check them out. We also publish these videos at this Facebook group. Then I upload them to YouTube and Rumble and at locals.com. Locals is another platform, fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com, where you can carry on some discussion with us and check out all of our past streams.
We believe that good society is based upon good conversation. It's okay to come into a conversation not prepared to do battle. It's okay to change your mind, and it is okay to have respect for those that you disagree with.
Steve and I have made two agreements that we think help our discussions amongst ourselves and with guests. The first of those agreements is that we avoid undefined they statements. So if we use the word they, we try to be specific about who that refers to. We also try to avoid undefined we statements. So regardless of our individual affiliations or our memberships, our groups, we are here this evening speaking on behalf of ourselves as individuals, and we ask that our guest do the same.
Well, tonight we're excited to have Len Faul with us. We're going to go ahead and bring Len on screen.
Sure thing. So, Len, here he is.
Hello, Len.
Good evening. Welcome.
So, Len, let me just speak first. I reached out to Len because I became aware, well, actually, I reached out to a group online called Police on Guard. That's the Twitter handle, and the Facebook handle is Police on Guard for Thee. And I became very interested in the void that that I saw that they were now filling. And I reached out to the organization and then was patient. And then eventually it was Len that returned my message, and we spoke by phone. I'm just really honored that he can make the time to be with us this evening. Len, could you please, I don't want to introduce you because we've just met, but if you could please share with us a little bit about your history and how you came to be involved with this initiative, and I'd love to hear from you.
Certainly. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. I was a police officer for over 43 years. I started my career with the Metropolitan Police in London, England. I served 11 years there before emigrating to Canada. I had 2 young children, and I saw there were great opportunities for them in Canada. On arrival, I joined the Toronto Police Service, and I served for just over another 32 years with the Toronto Police Service, and I retired with the rank of inspector. So I was a senior officer when I retired. I actually retired 10 years ago. Boy, how time flies.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. When the unknown situation in relation to COVID-19 started over a year ago now, we did not know what we didn't know. Was this going to be another Spanish flu? Were 50 to 100 million people worldwide going to die? Was it going to be another Ebola? We just had no way of knowing. And I felt comfortable that neither did our governments, not the federal government nor the provincial government, and certainly not our local health authorities in the province and in the cities. And they asked us to take certain precautions. And both of you know what Canadian society is like. If we are asked politely, we are probably amongst the most compliant people in the world. We will do what is asked of us when we're asked nicely. As time rolled on, and as we watched the situation unfolding around the world, it became obvious to everybody that there was a certain segment of our society that was at great risk. This being our elderly folk, particularly those with comorbidity issues, and those that were in long-term health facilities, and I use that term advisedly. because I wouldn't call most of them healthy. But it was obvious, even from the statistics that our own government, our own federal government, Stats Canada, were publishing, that for anybody else that got this dreadful flu, Wuhan flu, as it should correctly be called, it's a 99% recovery rate. Not only that, it is no longer an emergency. We've known about this for over a year now. It's not something that is rapidly developing and likely to cause millions of deaths. We know exactly what it's going to do. We know who's at risk, and we know under what circumstances they're going to be at risk. However, our governments, provincial governments particularly across the country, based on information only from their immediate health authorities, decided to introduce some emergency measures. In Ontario, we have the Reopen Ontario legislation, which is not reopening Ontario at all. And then came on the heels of that, the lockdown regulations, the stay at home and don't do anything regulations. And as I started to read through these regulations, as is my wont, I realized that immediately that they fly completely in the face of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I read through the regulations, I read through the legislation, I read through the Emergency Measures and Civil Protection Act, and it's very clear that all of these acts and regulations are supposed to comply with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And they clearly don't. They clearly take away fundamental, inalienable rights and freedoms from all of our citizens. They shut down businesses, they shut down schools. No school children are at risk from this. Most of the teachers are going to be young, healthy, fit individuals that are not going to suffer from this. And I became quite frustrated and really annoyed with our governments, all levels of governments. I live in Ottawa, which is our capital city, and our mayor here is somewhat more open, I think, than most mayors, insofar as he tried explaining to our premier that here in Ottawa, our numbers are not that bad. We were not seeing an increase in deaths. We were not seeing an increase in cases. In fact, we were going the other way. And the province is already broken up into zones, health-related zones, and could not understand why Ottawa was being penalised along with the rest of the province. And it wasn't a problem anywhere else in the province, I should hasten to add. But the Premier, Doug Ford, in his infinite arrogance, stated at a press conference in Montreal that he didn't want to see hordes of Quebecers flooding into Ottawa. Hordes. He did go on to say that he loves Quebecers and they're lovely people and so on, but the arrogance of the man was unbelievable. And also the ignorance of his capital city. Here in Ottawa, we actually have three cities. We have Ottawa, Gatineau, and Hull, separated only by the Ottawa River. We all have friends and family in Gatineau and Hull. Many of our workers here in the city come from those dormitory towns of Gatineau and Hull. And there was never, ever, for us anyway, some suggestion that the rest of Quebec would come flooding into Ottawa. Far from it, far from it. We are sort of a long way from anywhere other than our local people. And I was frustrated, and I knew I had to do something. I wasn't sure what I could do. As I say, I've been retired for 10 years. I'm yesterday's news, and I had to do something. Fortunately, my wife came across the Facebook page that you have referred to, Please Stand on Guard for Thee, and she said, you should check this out, see if you can be of any help to them. So I contacted them, much the same as you did. And I explained to them who I was and what my experience was. And they said they'd be only too pleased to have me help in whatever way I feel I can. And so I acknowledge that the officers that started Police on Guard for Thee, they are active officers, and their identities at this stage must remain secret, because as soon as their services know who these people are, no doubt in my mind whatsoever, there will be reprisals, and they know that too. So therefore, they wanted somebody who has some experience, who would support their message, and I wholeheartedly do. It's a message that comes from my heart and my experience, not necessarily just from the Police on Guard for Thee. And so, I have been trying my utmost to reach out to other active officers to explain to them what their roles and responsibilities are, and also to members of the public to try and educate them as to what the police can and cannot do. Their powers are quite limited under provincial legislation, and the enforcement of these regulations should never have been given to the police. It's not a police responsibility. We didn't do it during the Spanish flu. We didn't do it during the Hong Kong flu. We didn't do it during SARS. I was in Toronto working when SARS was about. We didn't do it in the bird flu or the swine flu. It's just unbelievable that this was hoisted on the police to enforce. This is not a policing matter. It is a health matter. And they're turning ordinary, everyday, good citizens into criminals, treating them like criminals when they're not. They're just people that want to go about their business. They want to follow their religious beliefs. They want to protest in peace. And they just want to get on with their day-to-day lives. They want to see their children and their grandchildren. I certainly do. I've got 5 grandchildren. Won't stop me from seeing them. And I have a group of friends that I haven't physically seen for over a year now, because none of them feel that they want to be in a crowd anywhere. And it's heartbreaking. So we have to make sure that even if this comes to an end, and it doesn't look as if it is going to come to an end soon, even if it does come to an end, that it must never happen again. That they must be held accountable for the wrongs that they have committed to the citizens of this country, to the wrongs.
Who's they in this
I'm
statement
sorry,
here?
the governments.
Okay.
The governments. The government, our federal government, from the Prime Minister on down, and from our provincial governments, from the premiers on down. They must be held accountable. And that's the only place that can happen is in court. And that is why I'm quite pleased to be a signator to an injunction taking the governments to court. And this, the Police on Guard for Thee group had already, before I was involved, already hired the services, they've retained, I should say, the services of Mr. Rocco Glady, who is a brilliant constitutional lawyer. And he has no doubt whatsoever that we will see this through to the end and we will be successful.
Len, thank you so much for that history. There's so much there that I hope we can explore. I'm almost tempted to jump in with some clarifying questions, but I think let's not for now. So Steve and Len, Steve and I have prepared, each of us, a fundamental question that we hope we can explore with you, understand your perspective, your interpretation of this question of ours, and then through the rest of our conversation, these 2 questions will sort of form a framework or a focal point for Steve and I to bring the conversation back from wherever, all the bird walks that we might take. My fundamental question, and just very briefly, and I'll maybe talk about it in more depth later, but it's really about this idea that it seems to me there are tests at play. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada is being tested. The governments in Canada, federal and provincial, are being tested. The officers are being tested. The citizens are being tested in ways that I think we've never been before. And I would love to know from your perspective, what you think the nature of that test is, and whether you think we're going to whether we're going to pass that test. But we'll come back to that. Steve, over to you. If you could relay your fundamental question, please.
So, Len, my question is specifically about policing. I've noticed many police forces throughout North America seem to have on their cars or on their shields or emblems to protect and serve. And that seems to be a fairly ubiquitous sentiment about what a police officer is there to do, or why a police force is comprised, is to protect and to serve. The other thing is you hear policing referred to as law enforcement. And so is, in your opinion and in your experience, is protecting and serving, is that an opposing or a complementary endeavor to enforcement? And how do you balance those things as a force, as an individual officer, and how does enforcing the law play into serving and protecting, especially in light of the current situation and many of the things that you've expressed? So that would be my question.
Okay, so where do we go from here? Len, one of the things we might do is just let you share your thoughts about the two statements we've just made, or is there something specific you'd like to drive at right now?
I think overarching both of those questions, and certainly the answers to them, is an explanation as to where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms fits into our law, into our culture and our society. And if I may,
let's be, yeah. And so if you might be speaking on behalf of a former inspector. I can appreciate that a constitutional lawyer might have a complementary perspective, but compatible, I would hope. And by the way, I have a copy of it right here if we need to refer to it. But yes, please. Steve and I, we were talking yesterday, and maybe to frame this part of the conversation, he observed that, and we're having some technical difficulty with your video, Steve, so I wonder, we just have to be patient here. Sorry about that for the audience. Steve observed that as he now lives in Utah and is a citizen of the United States, the Constitution of the United States appears to be given its authority by the citizens, in the sense that the Americans got together and said, we've decided we will create a government and we will give it some powers. Whereas in Canada, the first statement on the charter is, Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Is this opposite in ways? Where does the charter, of rights and freedoms in Canada derive its power?
In 1982, when our constitution was patriated from the UK, the government of the day recognized, the federal government recognized, that Canada would be a very strong democracy, very strong. They also recognized that with strong democracy, both at the provincial and federal level, there needed to be some safeguards for its citizens in order that governments did not overreach. So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was written up with the help of, as you say, constitutional lawyers, other lawyers, politicians, and even members of the public. Everybody, not everybody, but a large cross-section of the public was asked what they thought, what they wanted to see, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was generated. And it was placed...
Sorry, it followed the Bill of Rights by a number of years?
Yes, it did. The Bill of Rights.
Does it supersede that?
Yes, it did. Okay. Yes, the Constitution, same in the States, I guess, is our supreme law. There is nothing higher than it. And the reason that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was put inside the Constitution was exactly for that reason. It was to make it the preeminent law of the land, but also to ensure that those rights and freedoms were not taken away by any level of government. And so all laws, whether they be municipal bylaws, provincial laws, or federal statutes, must be tested against the freedoms and rights entrenched in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And if they're not, they can be challenged in a court of law. And as we have seen on many, many occasions, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms will be predominant. It will win out. It's rare, very rare, for our Supreme Court to have said, under these circumstances, we feel that on the balance, it is better for our citizens that this particular circumstance flies, yes, it flies in the face of rights and freedoms, but it's better for the citizens overall. And that, as I say, it is very rare. We've seen many, many laws struck down because they did not pass the test against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Len, do you have any familiarity, or you said you were an active on the force during SARS, during swine flu, bird epidemic, etc.
Yes.
Was the Quarantine Act of, I think it's a 2005 piece of legislation in Canada, was that ever brought to your attention? Was that ever brought to bear, I guess, in any of those types of situations?
Not within an enforcement perspective.
Okay.
In fact, people were asked to quarantine and they complied. Unfortunately, we had quite a large number of police officers, particularly in one part of our city, that had been in the 3 hospitals that were initially identified with SARS. They did not contract SARS, but because they had been in that situation without wearing any PPE, they were quarantined. They stayed at home. They were still taking their days off. They were still being paid while they should have been working and so on. But they were quarantined at home. But there was never any suggestion that they'd be thrown in jail, given serious fines or arrested or anything if they didn't quarantine. No suggestions of that at all. I was on the Metropolitan Police 1968 when we had the Hong Kong flu there. And it was very sad. 30,000 people died that particular year. But again, there was no suggestion of police enforcement or locking people up without due process. None of that happened at all.
Can I ask here, Len, sorry to interrupt you, but what might you say to someone who would say that they should have taken those extra measures back then? That those 30,000 people may have perished because we didn't lock down and the police didn't exercise specific enforcement. What might you say to that?
I would say to that, at the time, as I said before, we didn't know. We had not done it during the Spanish flu. Why would we now do it for something that wasn't quite as virile as that? We'd just never done it before. It just didn't. I don't think it crossed anybody's mind to even think of that. And
we've certainly not done it without, as you said just a moment ago, due process.
No, and that's another part of what we're facing here. And I think we have to come back to that a little later. But during the course of the last year, where we have seen very, very draconian lockdown rules, where we have seen hospitals being told they can only deal with COVID patients, therefore selective surgeries were shut down, people that were in need of diagnosis and treatments didn't receive them, children weren't allowed to go to school, businesses shut down. We have seen family lives falling apart. We're seeing a lot more domestic violence, a lot more substance abuse, and sadly, a lot more suicides. By the way, all of that is dealt with by your frontline police officer.
Yeah.
And we are now clearly seeing the devastating effects of lockdown are far, far worse than the virus could ever have been. And there are several now preeminent studies that would support that. This is not Len talking now. I know what I see in my own community. I know what I see in my own friends and family. But now we're seeing some really good studies. And
Can I
people,
just add, sorry, like
yes,
not only the list you've just expressed, but Ontario in particular has had some of the strictest lockdowns, I would argue, worldwide. For example, when, Steve, when you and I started this podcast a number of months ago, it was around the time that police in Ontario were given the authority to enter into someone's home without warrant.
no,
And Len, correct me if any of this is in error, but they could also remove people forcibly from a home if there was suspicion that they weren't part of the same family, and that had never happened, I think, in Canada. Also, there have been journalists now that have been arrested. In Canada, there's a pastor in jail right now. I just wanted to add a couple of those examples to the list.
yes. Yeah, that if I have been working in intelligence, and we were dealing with organized crime. And these are people that think nothing of murdering the opposition. In order to go into one of their homes, I would have to convince a judge that I had more than probable grounds to believe there would be evidence in there. And I can tell you, just to get one search warrant would often take several bankers' boxes full of evidence, hard evidence. And even then, the judge may not give it. And these are hardened criminals that we were dealing with, vicious thugs. So to suggest that a police officer could enter a house without a warrant is just, it's abhorrent to me. It's abhorrent to, I think, every thinking police officer. Nobody would do that. And we believe the house, your home, to be sacrosanct.
And yet,
No,
some officers have been doing that and have done that. Like, I wonder, I hope through our conversation you could share some experience or maybe some thoughts around how this document can be so easily forgotten.
I think there's a certain amount of deliberate attempt to ignore the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As you say, maybe it is a test. I'd never thought it in that light. I just honestly believe that our politicians got caught up in not knowing themselves what to do, and they listened to only one narrative only, and they felt that they had to do something. That was my initial belief. But I think there is more than enough evidence to show that they should have conducted a cost-benefit analysis to any lockdowns. And I'm not talking just financial, I'm talking in terms of health, education, and social situation. And they've not done any of these, and they've chosen deliberately not to do so. And you have to wonder why. And again, it's not just our provincial government, now our federal government are locking people up who are coming home. Our charter says it's okay for Canadian citizens to leave whenever they want and come home whenever they want. And now they're being detained in quarantine camps without any due process whatsoever. None. That is illegal. Under any other circumstances, the people responsible for this would be charged with forcible confinement. And I can't believe that the public is just going along with it. That's the other thing that just amazes me.
I can't believe it
They
either.
seem to think, well, the government's got to do something. They've got to protect us. Protect us from what? There is
Len,
nothing to protect us from.
you just said the words that is illegal.
Yes.
So I have a family friend who is a constitutional lawyer, and I've not talked with her much about this, but when COVID-19 was sort of breaking in the news, and it was still unclear how this would pan out, I was starting to be of the mind that maybe we're overreacting to this. But she said that she reminded me that this document that I'm holding guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So can you help me understand what reasonable limits may apply here, such that the government can quarantine and forcibly detain, as you say, a Canadian citizen, limit their mobility rights, limit their legal rights, their security of person, force people to have something enter their body, which was not allowed in the Quarantine Act of 2005, for example. What reasonable limits, what does that mean?
There is a test that has to be applied to legislation that is believed to be contrary to the Charter on Rights and Freedoms, and it comes from a case of R.V. Oakes, and we refer to it simply as the Oakes test. This is our Supreme Court decision, which means, again, it's final, and every piece of legislation must be held to that test. And it's a 4-part test. And it's not really that straightforward, but the Civil Liberties Group actually simplified it somewhat so that laypersons like me could understand it, and they refer to it as the ACORN test because it's a condensation of what the Oakes test is all about. And the first test that has to be applied is what is the purpose or objective of the limit. And is that an important objective in a free and democratic society? So I guess you could say, is it reasonable to consider people's health in the larger sense? The benefit of the masses outweighs the negative for the few. Possibly. That's certainly the first part of the test. And then the second part is, does it work? Does the law or action achieve its intended objective? Well, lockdown is not achieving its intended objective. People are dying. People are committing suicide. People are turning to substance abuse. People are going bankrupt. Children are not getting the education that they deserve. It is not achieving the objective. Is it reducing the number of cases that we are seeing? Well, if we stopped the phony PCR tests, yes, it would reduce the number. There would be a natural reduction of number.
Or even with the phony PCR test, as you say, comparing some jurisdictions that heavily locked down against other jurisdictions that did not lock down, the patterns of the cases rising and falling seems to be nearly identical. I'm talking
Absolutely.
about Arkansas beside Kansas. I'm talking about North Dakota against South Dakota, and so on. Like there's tons of these examples: Texas, California, Florida.
Absolutely, you can look across the pond to Sweden and England. Basically the same size population, basically the same mortality rate, basically the same infection rate. Sweden never locked down. England went through worse draconian lockdowns than we did. And it achieved nothing compared to, and Sweden's economy never faltered, their education systems never faltered, people got their selective surgeries.
So this debate is going to rage on for decades, but I think back to the test you're talking about.
Certainly.
The safest statement might be that it's not clear that it's achieving the objective.
No.
And
Therefore, it
is that
fails.
is that the third part of the test, and therefore it fails that test?
That's the second part. It
Second.
has to pass every single part of this. And as I say, it's doubtful, but arguable that it may or may not pass the first test. Certainly doesn't pass the second test. And the third part of it is where I think it is most damning. This is where the ACORN test has put minimal impairment proportionality under the same heading of what else does the limit do? This question combines those two, and you can ask to consider other outcomes, side effects, and consequences that may result from the law or action. These lockdowns, as we have clearly seen, are brutal. They're worse than the virus. Worse than the virus. Therefore, it fails completely, which is why we are seeing in many cases now, particularly those that have started to almost get for trial in Alberta, the Crowns are withdrawing them. They're withdrawing the charges. Now, why would that be? Mm-hmm. They don't want a decision. Even if they win at the lower court, by the time this gets to the Supreme Court, they will say, let's have a look at the Oakes test. You fail on the first part and you fail on, and the whole thing falls to pieces.
I'd like to add a context here, because you've mentioned a couple times now that the harms of the lockdowns are obvious, as you say. I think we should that's a claim that should not go without citation. So I'd like to add that Statistics Canada, I believe 2 days ago or 3, published, or at least I became aware of it 2 days ago. They've now published a document showing that through the first part of 2020, the excess deaths in Canada closely followed the case numbers, closely followed the COVID-19 deaths. But starting in the fall, September-ish, the excess deaths no longer follow the COVID-19 fatalities. So there's a gap now that can't be explained by COVID deaths, and they speculate that gap now is filled with largely overdoses, unfortunately.
Yes, suicides quite often.
Statistics Canada. This is not known to be a group that futzes with their numbers. These are carefully published numbers, and I think we should heed the warning.
And they are a controlled arm of the federal government. So this is your federal government telling you what those numbers are. And I think they're quite plain and obvious.
Thanks for taking me through that Oakes test. I've been wanting to understand it more. I've been monopolizing the conversation here, Steve. I'm sorry.
Len, so for a long time, you made an interesting statement in your introduction, said, we're Canadians. We're pretty polite. If you ask us nicely to do something, we're generally going to comply with that. And I would agree. I believe there's, and I don't know what the numerical number would be, but I would say in general, the government, preponderance of scientists, whatever, make some statements. We think you should probably wear masks. It'll be years before we have, perfect empirical evidence about it, but we think it may help. We feel like if you'll stay in your nuclear families, generally, especially if you're seeing those numbers rise in your community, that will help. Limiting to some extent or to whatever extent possible your comings and goings and shopping and the rest of it, and those kinds of common sense things, we think that may help. And I think that 80-90% compliance could be achieved simply by saying that. Maybe south of the border here, 60-65% compliance. We don't qualify as Canadians in that regard, but and then to add to that what you've referred to, and I would agree in a lot of cases, draconian lockdown enforcement measures and to go to the extent of creating special legislation, even to have to get to the point of applying the Oakes test in Canada and saying, what freedoms might we limit or whatever in order to do this. Those kinds of measures, I can't imagine add more than 5 or 10% extra compliance to what's already willingly happening in society. And so my question is, and I don't know that there's an answer to this, but is it the virus itself and the pandemic situation itself that creates the suicides, the depressions, the divisiveness, the political and social divisiveness that we've seen just really get out of control in both our countries, probably all over the world to some extent? Would that still exist, or is it the attempt and the overreach by government to try and, I don't know, somehow get that extra few percentage points by force? Is that what is creating the negative effects of the mitigation efforts?
I think that will become a very, very interesting social study, and I'd like to apply for a government grant to do that. And I don't know that it will ever be achieved. I think what we've just got to look at is what's the result. The government, the provincial governments, federal governments have done this to us. They have caused this. If people were just simply asked to comply, as you say, Steve, I think the vast majority would. And if they did not interfere, and this is where I think it really is rankling an awful lot of Canadians, interfere in our rights to assembly, whether that be for religious purposes or for sporting events or to protest against the government, for us to dare to say that we don't like what you're doing to us and send the stormtroopers in to disperse us. We don't like that. We don't like that. We can stop, as Canadians, we can stop being polite and we can stop being complacent. So at the end of the day, the government, the provincial government, the federal government must be held accountable.
Len, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, so we see these. David just shared with me the incident that happened in Alberta, where the young man was pulled out of his tractor for crossing the road. There was the incident I saw a few months ago about the someone in a costume outside of is it a stormtrooper costume or something outside of a comic book store, and the police came with guns drawn, and we see, these hyper sensationalized, one-off kind of situations. Share with us some of your experience. And maybe going back to my fundamental question, that balance between enforcement and serving and protecting the public in general. What are police officers being faced with right now in Canada, in your experience, and from what you've heard, and how are the good and the bad, how are they navigating that?
Yeah, and I think the answer to this can ping a little on your earlier question in relation to the difference between serving and protecting and being law enforcement. Quite frankly, we do not think of ourselves first and foremost as law enforcement in Canada, no more than I did in England. I have explained a little bit about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I don't think you need to be a constitutional lawyer to be able to read that. It's straightforward. It really is simple. It was deliberately designed to be simple that way. And all officers in Canada take an oath of office, much like doctors take a Hippocratic oath and lawyers take an oath and so on. Police officers take an oath, and it is to serve and protect citizens, to guarantee everyone's rights and freedoms, and to discharge their duties faithfully, impartially, and according to the law. The prime objective of an efficient police service anywhere in Canada is the prevention of crime. That's the first thing that we have to do, is prevent crime. Next comes that of intervention when crimes have been committed. So law enforcement is not high on our radar. We're good at it, we do it, and we're very effective at it. But it's not our raison d'etre. Working with our communities is paramount to us. We work on the premise that we can't get our job done unless we have the consent of the public. And that's based on what Sir Robert Peel said in 1829 when he organised the Metropolitan Police as the first organised police service, that the police are the public and the public are the police. Throughout my career, I was still a member of the public. I had family, I had children, I had friends. I went to sporting, I played sports, went to sporting events as a spectator. I volunteered with a number of organisations. I was a member of the public. We're all members of the public. We're all in this together. And as a police officer, I could not get my job done without the help and consent of the public. And what this situation is causing, and again, I have to wonder if it's being done deliberately, it is causing a rift between the police and their public, between the citizens and their police officers. And we've not experienced that before in Canada. We're seeing some really unusual things happening. In Toronto, my police service, if there is a protest and it's a group of people that are saying to their government, you must stop these lockdowns because they're bad for us, the mayor cannot say to the chief of police, I want you to go in and arrest people and issue tickets. He is prohibited from interfering in operational side of policing. However, we have heard Mayor Tory at a news conference saying, these people on Dundas Square, what they're doing is wrong and it must be stopped. That's a very clear indication to me.
The police force is then being used to go and stop that activity.
Absolutely. At the same time,
under somebody's authority, presumably.
Absolutely. The chief is responsible for operational policing. Just like on the plaque on the president's desk in the White House, there's a plate that says the buck stops here.
Yeah.
Stops with the chief of police. He's the one that calls the shots. And in Toronto, a couple of weekends ago. Go ahead.
Just for clarification, the government is three branches: the executive, the judicial, and the administrative branch. Do police forces such as the Toronto Met or the RCMP or the OPP, which branch do they fall under, if any?
They don't. There is what's called a police service board.
They are public, like
They're
you
public.
say. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, they are public. And there is a police service board that is responsible for setting business plans, for identifying priorities, for setting standards, for negotiating during grievances with wages, etc., during times of arbitration and so on. And also they hire the chief and the deputies. But what they must not do, what they are not allowed to do, is interfere with the operational side of policing. So they could and by the way, the mayor sits on the police service board.
Okay.
And the mayor is responsible for hiring the chief and the deputies. Did I say that? Yeah, okay.
You didn't, but now you did.
Okay, they're responsible for doing that. And in Toronto, acting chief James Raymer, I'm sure he would like to be the chief. And if he hears the chair of his police service board saying that what these people are doing in Dundas Square is wrong, I think that's a pretty clear message. Mm-hmm. What's said behind closed doors, I can't comment on because no one will know. But the situation in Toronto was interesting because whilst a couple of weekends ago, whilst that anti-lockdown protest was taking place, in another part of the city, another protest was taking place. Friends of the Foundry. They were protesting about the impending demolition of what they would like to have seen designated as a historic building. A city councillor was there, 2 MPPs were there, and strange enough, the leader of the Green Party was there. And do you know who was not there? No police. Not a policeman in sight anywhere. And there were a couple of hundred, from what I could see from the video, there was at least a couple of hundred people protesting. They had signs, not wearing masks. They weren't social distancing. They were lawfully exercising their right to gather and protest. And quite rightly so, there was no interference by the police because there was no need. None at all. So even within one city, we can see a disparity between who's being treated one way and who's being treated another. Now, in Vancouver, they have quite frequent protests there. And the health authorities have said to the chief there, you must get out there and disperse these people and start arresting them and start issuing tickets. And he basically said no. The media immediately jumped all over this and they started vilifying him and he's not doing his job. And he then made a clear public statement. He said, we've looked at the COVID situation. None of these people are at risk. They're not doing anything wrong. They are exercising their rights as designed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Here in Ottawa, which is our capital, just finish the analogy here. Here in Ottawa, which is our capital city, a couple of weekends ago, on Parliament Hill, there was a protest. You can't have a gathering there unless you've got a permit. And the authority for policing Parliament Hill resides with what's called the Parliamentary Protective Services. Under a federal act, they are given the authority of police officers for Parliament Hill. And that follows the dreadful situation of a domestic terrorist killing a voluntary soldier at the Cenotaph and then forcing his way into Parliament buildings and finally being shot by the Sergeant at Arms. So they introduced the Parliamentary Protective Services, and for all intents and purposes, they are the police for the Hill. And on the day that the protest took place, strangely enough, my wife went with her sister and husband. There were a few hundred people there. They were protesting the lockdowns. They were protesting the quarantine camps. They were protesting masks. They were concerned, and there was a young teenager there talking about friends that had committed suicide. And the Parliamentary Protective Services were there in uniform. They let people in at the gate. They mingled with the crowd. They were respectful. They were polite. They engaged in conversations. What they did not do was issue any tickets. They did not arrest anybody. They did not harass and disperse the crowd and chase people away. They said what their job there was to do was to protect the people, serve the public and protect the people. The city itself is policed by the Ottawa Police Service, and I had occasion to communicate with Staff Sergeant Kenny of the Ottawa Police Service, and I said, what are you going to do about this protest on the Hill? He said, it's not our bailiwick. That's the responsibility of the Parliamentary Protective Services. However, we do send officers to the vicinity, and if the situation gets out of hand and they need our help, they can call on our help and we will go in and back them up. I said, well, what if it's a COVID type situation? He said, our role here in Ottawa is to uphold citizens' rights and freedoms first. He said, when it comes to COVID, we will take an educational stance. Now, also at Parliament Hill are the RCMP. They were nowhere to be seen, and they rarely ever are out at the protest, but they were, on this occasion, they were never seen. So it was a very, very peaceful protest. Lots of very good speakers stood up and talked, and there was no issues with enforcement because people were exercising their legal rights. So if that can happen in Vancouver, it can happen in Ottawa. Why is it not happening in Toronto? Why is it not happening in Edmonton? Why is it not happening in Calgary? We're seeing some outrageous situations where the police are vastly overstepping their roles and responsibilities. Under the emergency measures, it's a provincial legislation, which means it's not that big a deal because it's only provincial. The federal laws are much different. They are carry a lot heavier weight. So under provincial legislation, there's no occasion where somebody need identify themselves. Mm-hmm. Even within the Emergency Measures Act, you don't need to identify yourself. And yet police officers, and I've seen it on the videos, and I was disgusted when I saw it, they have been arresting people for what they call obstruct police. That's a criminal offence. And they're daring to suggest that somebody that's exercising their lawful rights is committing a criminal offence. In fact, the shoe is on the other foot. In Canada, under the criminal code, it is a criminal code offence to interfere with a protest. We have seen Pastor Coates locked up for his religious beliefs. We have seen the pastor in Alma, Ontario, persecuted for his religious beliefs. It is a criminal offence under the Criminal Code of Canada to interfere in religious fundamentals. These people must be held accountable. And by these people, I mean the health authorities, the attorney generals, whoever else has their finger on deciding that a pastor should be locked up without due process. I hasten to add, he hasn't had a trial yet. We let murderers go on bail.
He's been in prison now 3 weeks, 4 weeks?
It's just under 4 weeks, and he's got another 2 months to go before the trial. And at the trial, the worst that he can get is a fine. So how do you justify that? How can these? How can they go home? How can the Attorney General of Alberta go home and look at himself in the mirror and say, "I've done a good job today"? I don't get it.
Can I ask you, because you just said these people need to be held accountable, and you listed a number of roles, none of whom were the officers themselves, but officers are at risk or not of criminal charge?
Absolutely, yes, they are. It's one of the things that we impress upon all our officers right from day one, right throughout their entire careers, that they are personally responsible for everything they do. For every action they take, they are personally responsible. We impress upon them that as a result of the Nuremberg trials, the rules still stand that you cannot use as a defense, "I was ordered to do so." It may be used in mitigation for sentencing, but it is not a defense. If what you're being told to do, and let me clarify this, police officers must obey lawful orders. They must. And in the same breath, they must not obey unlawful orders. And let me give you a little bit of an insight here. In Toronto, a senior officer was talking to the officers before they went out onto one of these protest parades, situations for anti-lockdown. And he said, "Our job out there is to arrest people, is to issue summonses, it's to make sure they keep their social distancing and to disperse the crowds if possible. But don't forget, you're all individually responsible for your own actions." What's he trying to say there?
How does an officer navigate that?
And I'll tell you, it's really simple. It actually is a lot simpler than it sounds. If, as a senior officer, I was at the scene of an event and I saw something happening which I felt warranted some police intervention, where somebody should be issued a ticket or should be arrested, what that senior officer what they are doing is saying to the officers, "Go over there, arrest that person and issue those tickets." What an officer should have said, would have said to me was, "Sir, if you see an offence, go deal with it. You're a policeman, get over there and deal with it. I don't see anything." I don't see anything wrong. And there was, no, just a minute. Let me finish here. It's called discretion. Officers, the greatest power they have is the power of discretion. I cannot order an officer to arrest anybody. I cannot order an officer to issue a ticket. If I'm in pursuit of somebody, I'm chasing after them, and they're clearly running away from me, I can shout at the top of my voice to an officer down the street, "Stop that man." And they will stop them. And then when I get there, I will arrest them. But I can't order anybody to arrest somebody. The only time that can happen is when a court has issued a warrant for somebody's arrest, and the warrant directs an officer to go and arrest that person. So without the warrant, it's just like going into a house. You don't go into a house unless you've got a warrant. And every police officer knows that. And they know they've got the power of discretion, which is why the chief of Vancouver, the chief of Ottawa, and several other chiefs across the country, we can't tar all of them with the same brush, have decided that from their perspective, discretion is the better part of valor. And I applaud them for that.
So somebody listening, what would be the difference between the discretion that you're discussing and selective enforcement? Unfair, I'm going to turn a blind eye to this, and I'm going to concentrate on this person that I don't like for whatever reason, or I'm going to single out this person or this group. Somebody listening to this may jump. I could just hear somebody saying, well, wait a minute. So the cops can just decide what they feel like enforcing or what they feel like is a crime at the time. But from your perspective, it sounds like you're saying that's an incredibly important tool that an individual officer needs to have, is the power of discretion.
Absolutely. It's an absolute must. And again, we have seen circumstances where these so-called emergency measures, officers are being forced to go out there and deal with it. And we've seen where they have lacked some discretion, where I can think of two pretty good examples here. One of the regional authorities went out because somebody had complained there was kids tobogganing on a hill. So the officer went there, and there were parents there were kids there, and he basically told them, "Oh, you must leave. You can leave here. There's too many of you. You've got to leave." Well, he doesn't have any authority to do that to start with. What he should do is ask, is there more people in here than the suggested family group size? No, these are all my kids. Fine. Thank you. Have a nice day. But he didn't. He dispersed everybody. The very same day, in a different part of the province, an OPP officer was sent to another tobogganing hill. He saw that there were kids there. He saw there were families there. Do you know what he did? He got on the toboggan and he slid down the hill and he wiped out at the bottom of it. That's good community policing. That's using your discretion. When he went there, he said, "I didn't see anything wrong." It's not a case of, I'm going to pick on this guy, but I'm not going to pick on that one. It's a case of doing what's right. And that power of discretion is what needs to be done right. Our public deserve it. They deserve to be treated fairly. They deserve to be treated impartially. And they deserve to be treated according to the law. That's what our oath says. And that oath is not just what we do, it's who we are. That defines us. And that's why we are not a police state. And we must never, ever become a police state. And that's why in every free democratic society throughout the Western world, all police officers are held individually for their own actions. And we've seen some terrible situations in the US of officers where at the end of the day it was alleged they'd overstepped their responsibilities and they've been held accountable. Albeit personally held accountable. In Ontario, I can't speak for the rest of the country, but in Ontario we have had civil circumstances in civil court where not just the police service has been sued, not just the city, not just other interested entities have been sued, but the individual officer that was responsible for making a decision was held civilly liable. That can get very expensive for the officer. Police service, it's interesting and mildly amusing, but it doesn't come out of the police budget, it comes out of the city budget. But when an individual officer is held civilly liable, it could cost a lot of money. So you've got several tiers of responsibility, of jeopardy for officers that are putting themselves at risk, starting with complaints against police, which may lead to Police Service Act, internal labor dispute dealings. Then you've got civil process. They could be charged criminally. I mean, it's unbelievable the risk that most of these officers that are involved in heavy-handed enforcement are placing themselves in. They're a great jeopardy. And the other thing is, just because the situation finishes doesn't mean to say the investigation into what the police did will stop. Look at the G20 that we had in Toronto in 2010. We're still dealing with that. That's not over yet. That's a long time ago. I was actually working during the G20. I didn't have anything to do with crowd control. I was responsible for the motorcades that were moving all the internationally protected persons. But I could still see what was happening. And I was watching some of the videos and I was looking and saying, what on earth are they doing? Why are they holding all those people there in the rain and not letting them go? What authority did they have to arrest hundreds of people like that? It was mind-boggling. It was absolutely mind-boggling. And now those people have been held accountable and liable.
Then that experience was, I would argue, the very first time in my upbringing in this country that I didn't recognize the country.
Yes.
I was in Toronto at that time. I was living out west, but I brought my wife to Ontario. We were going through Toronto for a few days and then Ottawa for Canada Day. And seeing, first of all, the riots and violence. That was the first time I had ever heard the term Black Bloc.
Yes.
And then we were hearing these techniques of law enforcement, the kettling technique, and it seemed like the news media were very interested in these techniques and how much money was spent and given to the Toronto Police Force to prepare the security apparatus for this event, and how effectively they were applying these forceful measures. I thought the whole thing was absurd, and it
Absolutely.
frightened me to think that. So one of the things that Steve and I have kind of circled around sometimes in our conversations is this relationship between federal, provincial, or in his region, the union and the states. Steve, is that the right dichotomy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Federal government versus provincial or state government.
And then the authorities given to the various police or military forces. So I don't know, Len, if this is an incorrect way to think about it, but military is essentially aimed, for lack of a better word, outward at foreign relations and international and security, securing the country. Police forces are aimed inwardly, but not to be used, as you've described, without extreme caution.
Correct.
At what point, though, right now, and I wonder if you can kind of maybe put yourself in the shoes of an active duty officer, but the way you're talking about the service that an officer provides to its public, to its citizens, is that an officer has responsibility and authority simultaneously. Is it possible that in this climate, an officer might feel they've got responsibility, but they're acting on the authority of a superior officer, such that they would negate their own oath, believing that they're acting on someone else's authority. Like, how does this break happen in an officer?
It certainly is not happening in large numbers of officers. The vast majority still firmly believe in their oath and will not breach their oath. It's as simple as that. The vast majority will not. The sad part of this situation is that the police associations, this is like the working union, for want of a better term, we call them the police associations because we're prohibited from having a union. So we call them associations, have done nothing to support their members. Their job is to serve and protect their members, and they've not done that. I spoke personally to the president of the union in Toronto, and I asked them, so what's the situation there? What are you doing to protect your officers from the jeopardies that they're facing here? And he said, oh, it's okay, Len, we have sought legal advice and they're safe. I said, okay, well, maybe you could explain that to me then. I worked in our professional standards branch for 2 years. I know what it is to put an officer in jeopardy. And how is it that you are mitigating this then? He said, well, we've sought legal advice. I said, okay, well, can you share that with me? He said, no. I said, well, maybe I could talk to the legal authority that you got this from, the lawyers that you got it from. No. And I haven't talked to him since. And I find that very sad that the associations are not supporting their membership. And it's taking brave individual officers to stand up and dig their heels in and say, no, we must not do this. We cannot do this. It's really difficult for people of a very high moral standard, a high ethical standard, to be told to do something that they know is inherently wrong. Maybe they could be told to do it once and they could perhaps turn a blind eye and deal with it once. But to be dealing with this day after day for years, this is taking, just this side of it is taking a tremendous toll on the officers. We're seeing a lot more anxiety. We're seeing a lot more officers off sick. They are suffering the same as everybody else. They're suffering the same as the rest of their community, the rest of their public. It really is, it's not at a head yet, but it's, I hate to think that it's coming, but I'm sure it will. But again, there are many instances of good work being done, of a whole police service taking a stand and saying, no, we believe in upholding the charter. What has amazed me is we have in each province there is an association of chiefs of police. So there's an Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police, there's Alberta Association of Chiefs of Police. There's also an umbrella organisation called the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. And there's a representative from each of the provinces and the RCMP, and they collect together and they can really have some lobbying power, for want of a better term, with levels of governments. They can also decide on how cohesive they can be across the country when dealing with certain situations. And I am both amazed and appalled that the CACP or any of the provincial associations of chiefs of police haven't said to their political masters, the Premier and the health authorities, we understand what you're saying. We get what it is you want us to do, but from our perspective, that is a breach of the officer's oaths and a breach of the charter, and therefore we are going to seek civil advice from a court-competent jurisdiction. None of them have done that, and it's there for them to do. And they could get some clear clarification as to just how important our charter is in Canada or not.
Len, is it possible that they have done that and it's not
No,
been known publicly? Okay.
no.
Is it, is
It
it,
would be known publicly, and we have, as I mentioned, constitutional lawyers across the country that are fighting on behalf of the communities, fighting on behalf of groups, and certainly they would be the first to know if that had been attempted, and it
Len,
hasn't.
is it possible also that there's some gray area here with the authorities granted currently to the health bureaucrats? So, like I understand in the Quarantine Act of 2005, this is a document written for Ebola with or Marburg, like with 70% fatality and extreme contagion, and so that the health authority can say, hey, we've learned that there's someone in Toronto Pearson Airport. We need to go now and apprehend that person or contain them. And that person is, officers are granted authority to go and arrest that person or whatever. But
Yes.
that type of authority seems to be used currently to go and just sweep through, peaceful protests in a
Yeah.
church or whatever. Is there gray area here, or is it actually very
No.
cut and dried?
No, again, it's very cut and dry. I mentioned this before, where officers must have probable grounds before they can do anything. And in the Quarantine Act, it still uses that term that the health official, the designated quarantine officer, must have probable grounds. Probable grounds. So, if you're in Utah and you decide to fly up to Toronto, before the airline will let you get on the plane, you have to take one of their tests. You're negative. They'll let you on the plane. What possible probable grounds could anybody draw from that to suggest that you are carrying the virus, or that you've been exposed to the virus, or there's a potential that you could have been exposed to the virus and are carrying it? There are no probable grounds. So what they're doing is illegal. It says so right in the Quarantine Act. They must have probable grounds, which is why you are seeing a few people now, when they have been challenged at the border, when they're coming home to Canada, as Canadians are allowed to, they're saying, no, you're not sticking that thing up my nose. You are not penetrating my body in order to take a test. Again, this is something left over from the Nuremberg trials. Anything that breaches your body has to be voluntary. And no, I'm not going to volunteer. And no, I'm not going to go to your quarantine camp. So they get issued a ticket.
Yep.
And those tickets are going to go nowhere. So it's obvious that what they're doing is they're using fear in order to drive compliance. And that fear can only last so long before thinking people will stand up and say, you know what? I don't think you've got the authority to do this. And I'm not going to comply. I'm not going to be complacent.
It turns
And I
out
think
there's
we will
two
start
ways.
to see. Yes, it does.
It turns out there's two ways Canadians will abide. One is if you ask nicely, and then the other one is if you scare the heck out of them.
Yes, and that's what they've been using. The media have been driving this fear factor. Not long ago, just a couple of months ago, the Ottawa Sun headlines: another deadly day of virus outbreaks. So I thought, oh my God, what's happened? So we look at it, and another 18 people had tested positive. So I'm reading. No one's died. They just tested positive. So how is that a deadly outbreak? And where do the media get their incentive from?
Yeah, we've talked
Mainstream
about
media.
that quite a bit here
Mainstream media.
on our podcast. How journalism is dead,
Oh,
clearly, very clearly.
non-existent. I've been very fortunate to be able to talk to one mainstream journalist in the Toronto Sun, Joe Warmington, who published one of my articles, and he has been published in other articles. His editor, Fury, has also taken a bit of a lead here, but they all have to be watered down. They all have to be really sort of non-committal, but at least they were saying something. There's plenty of other alternate medias out there that are getting the message out. But now we see that our federal government, under the leadership of our Prime Minister, are going to introduce Bill C-10, which will curtail free expression on the internet.
Yeah, I'm also worried about that and watching it closely.
That is getting us, that together with what they want to do with the firearms legislation, is getting as frightening as I've ever thought Canada could get. I never, in my wildest dreams, thought that I would see this type of legislation coming before our parliaments. And the sad thing about it is there's no political opposition. Nobody seems to be standing up and saying, no, we're not going to support this. We need to debate this. We need to get some more information about this. And you're a minority government, and this is not going to fly. It's not happening. And that is really, really scary. Really worrying. And I don't know if you have read through C-21 for the firearms. Hidden at the end of the legislation is a small little paragraph that says, by ordering council, which means it doesn't have to be debated in Parliament, the federal government can arm civil servants. Why would you want to arm civil servants?
Civil servants? Like,
yes.
Example of that? Like someone working at the Service Canada office? Someone
could be.
Working
that person is a civil servant. Or perhaps they could
that's
hire.
A very strange.
It's terrifying.
Or the private security force that was alluded to in the announcement about the quarantine hotels and that whole border reentry situation. They said predominantly enforcement will be handled by these private security firms on behalf of the government.
Yeah. So if they swear them in as civil servants, they can arm them. If they decide to hire 10,000 young men between the ages of 20 and 25, all 6'6", blonde hair and blue eyes, and put them in the same uniform and call them clerks, they could then arm them. This is terrifying.
History repeating itself. Yes, and that's another conversation probably that we ought to have.
I think it should be, but it certainly seems to be flying on the tails of this COVID situation. It's that fear that they're using. It's that driving a wedge between police services and the public. It's dividing families. It's ruining small businesses. I can't go to church and pray with my fellow religious people, but I can go to Walmart and I can be shoulder to shoulder with people in there, jostling and shopping to my heart's content. If I go to my local restaurant, I can only sit 4 at a table and there's plexiglass all the way around us. I can go to Whole Foods and sit in the restaurant there shoulder to shoulder with people and eat to my heart's content.
They're so arbitrary. What's happening in Utah these days? Like, do you see any of that nonsense?
So I wear a mask about once a week right now. We do go to church. We have a limited capacity, so we have our church congregation split in half, and half of us go A through K one week and M through the rest of the alphabet the next week. And we do wear masks in church because we've been asked to, but there's some grocery stores here that are very strict about it, so I wear a mask there. But Walmart, I don't generally wear a mask. I don't wear a mask at work. You know, most workplaces that I've seen, there's always a sign on the window that says, please wear a mask according to government mandate, etc. But then you go through the doors and almost no one is wearing it. And it's not being terribly enforced. I think the mask mandate is set to expire here in this state on April 10th. And and the governor here have made a statement recently, maybe a couple weeks ago, and he said, I may have to eat my words. I hope I don't eat my words, but I intend to stand with a very large crowd of unmasked people on July 4th and watch fireworks and a parade and celebrate Independence Day.
Good.
So hopefully that's the direction we're going. We saw a very significant spike. There was a lot of deaths and a lot of tragic circumstances through November, December, January, but it spiked then, and it's precipitously fallen since then, and we're like a virus going through our town, and doing some damage. Certainly nothing to laugh about or scoff at or anything else, but nonetheless a spike that happened. And all of the desperate mitigation efforts that we did from February of 2020 through August of 2020, September of 2020, in our particular area. I mean, it was already hitting New York, Florida, California to some extent, but we didn't see the deaths start really mounting at a quick pace until the fall, and now it's fallen off again. But so it's interesting. Well, Len, we really appreciate your generosity with your time. I find you just be a really interesting and really genuine individual, and I appreciate having this conversation. Could we kind of give you the last word? How do you intend personally to navigate through this in your own life, and is there any appeal that you would like to make to law enforcement individually or to the public in general as we close our conversation here?
My intent is to enjoy my family, enjoy my beliefs, and not be restricted by arbitrary regulations that are flying in the face of what I know to be my personal freedoms. I have incredible support from my family. We all are singing from the same song sheet here, every single one of us. Sadly, some of my friends are not. I hope to get through to them sooner or later. And I will do my utmost to remind every police officer of their power of discretion, and also remind them of their oath, and that they are responsible for their citizens in their community. They have to look after them and not treat them like criminals, because they're not. And at the same time, I would try and reach as many members of the public as I can, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you to further that cause, to get through to the public that it's okay for them to know what the powers and responsibilities of the police are, for them to know what police can and cannot do. That's a good thing. They should know that, and they should challenge the police officers when they're being faced with them. Be calm, be polite, speak softly. That would disarm most aggressive police officers. If you flare up in their face, our training is that we're always one level lower than the state of the person we're dealing with. So if you remain calm, if you remain cool, and you speak politely, it will disarm them. And then ask them why. Why do you want to know? Why are you doing this? What authority do you have to do this? And then if they just keep on and on, I demand to know your name, just simply be firm and say no. No, you're not going to know my name. You're not going to know my address. So only certain circumstances when I have to identify myself. If I'm driving a car on the road, public road, police can stop me and ask for my license, ownership, and insurance. They can ask, but nobody else in the vehicle needs to identify themselves ever. And so I think again, we have been blessed in Canada that our citizens have not had to challenge police. They've not had to ask them why. They've trusted them. They've known that they're there for them. If the policeman's asking me to do this, there's a very good reason for it, and they trust them. And I think to a great extent, we've lost a lot of that trust, a lot of it. And it's going to take a lot of work to get it back again. But we need the public to stand up. As I said earlier, yes, we're compliant, but sadly, we're also somewhat complacent. And we want to remove that complacency. We want them to become a bit more knowledgeable about what's being done to them and what they can do in turn. One of the things that I am suggesting that they do is to attend protests more often, to attend protests in larger numbers, to take the families with them, take the kids, take the grandchildren, take the grandparents, everybody go to the protests. Write to their civil representatives, write to your city councillor, to the mayor, to your MPP, to the Premier, write to your MPs, write to the Prime Minister, write letters. Sending emails is good, don't get me wrong, nothing wrong with that. But as we all know, you can dispose of 1,000 emails in one click of a button in less than a heartbeat and they're all gone. Whereas a pile of letters arriving in the mail, somebody has to open those letters. Somebody has to read through them. They have to end up on somebody's desk, and it's an imposing sight when you see a huge pile of letters, basically all saying the same thing. And in those letters, remind them that there will be an election coming up in the near future. And I've not liked what you've done. And I may not vote for you unless you fix this. Because as we know, all politicians, they can only look as far ahead as the next election. So we need to let them know where it's going to hurt. We need members of the public to talk to their friends, talk to the family, talk to the neighbors. Don't get into arguments with them, but open the conversation, much the same as you guys are doing. Open the conversation. Get people talking about it. Get people thinking. Get people doing their own research. Don't just listen to what your local health authority is telling us, because it may not be accurate. I don't want to go any further than that. Don't listen to what your government is telling you. It may be a pack of lies. Do your own research. Find out for yourself. There's lots of wonderful authorities out there now, that eminent scientists and doctors, there's groups of doctors now, groups of scientists are saying, these lockdowns, it's devastating what it's doing to our communities. It's devastating what it's doing to our countries. We must not do this again. And more importantly, we must be in a position where we can put a stop to this and never, ever let it happen again. Thank you.
Len,
Thank you.
it's been really nice to talk with you. I just want to reiterate that when I first saw the group, Police on Guard, it really struck me to see, I think it was a hashtag, remember your oath. And it was really clear to me that the audience are the officers, not
Yes.
me. And I just felt some optimism in seeing that hashtag, because it, like Steve said, after seeing all these really terrible videos, and these are rare. I understand that,
Yeah.
but it doesn't matter that they're rare. They hit the mainstream very quickly, and they spread very quickly, and they become the picture we have of our police forces. And so please pass along my personal gratitude to the others you work with in the organization. Thanks for being here this evening and taking our questions and having some conversation with us.
It's been very interesting and quite in depth. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for helping get the message out there. This is very important. We've all got to stand together. We've all got to stand up and be counted. So thank you.
So
Thank you.
Len, how this works next is I'm going to hide you. We're going to take you off screen. Then Steve and I are going to stick around a little bit just to talk amongst ourselves here, to debrief a little bit about our conversation we've had. Just so you know that when you do disappear from screen, you will still be heard if you make noise. So you're welcome to stick around and listen, or you can leave the meeting and tune in maybe other ways. But I hope to talk with you again, and I just thanks so much for being here.
Okay, I'll stick around and listen. Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Len.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Steve, over to you. You were quieter tonight than usual, or maybe I was too talkative.
You can never be too talkative. No, it was good. I really enjoyed Len. I think there wasn't a lot of what he said that I disagreed with in any way. I know individuals that probably would disagree with maybe much of what he said, but I appreciated so much, and I think it goes exactly to the heart of what we're trying to do here with this podcast. Is he was so articulate and so careful and so um, genuine about it, you know, and and we just when he right at the end when he said, we need to stand together and be
Mm.
counted. What's interesting is we don't need to stand in the same exact space ideologically. That's not what our government and our society, our free society, relies upon, is for people to line up and be in lockstep with each other uh, in any or on any subject. But it does require us to stand up and be counted, just like he said, and to have an opinion, to take the time and to do our research and to do our due diligence and to form an opinion, and then to be willing to politely and respectfully have a discussion about that opinion, and then to be able to change our minds again and again and again as we are confronted with evidence and ideas. And uh, I don't know, I thought that's how it was. I thought that's how
Mm.
our governments came to be in North America. And 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 we have such a history, uh, such a legacy of doing that. And and it would be a shame to let that go to any degree. And I think that's the activism that needs to happen, is being active at all, politically, socially. We've talked about how politics isn't king. Politics does not, you know, necessitate what reality is or what society is, but it is a piece of it. You know, but yeah, just stand up and be counted. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think there was some great cautionary tales there and some great counsel given. And yeah,
Maybe there is one thing that we ought to be lockstep with, however, and that is, I'm looking at this document and I'm thinking that this is, in a way, a definition of Canada and what it means to be Canadian. And shouldn't we all be able to say there's value in this document, and we should look at what's happening currently and check if it's matching what is written here. And if it isn't matching, we should be able to say, wait a minute, do we want to throw this document out or not? And I would hope that anyone because when I see these these videos of officers doing what I think is clearly an overstep, it feels to me like this document is being injured in some way, and it's death by a thousand cuts, so to speak. Shouldn't we all be able to stand in lockstep and say, that's what it means to be Canadian, and we're not going to stand for actions of government or law or police forces that negate what's written in that document?
One of my favorite Canadians is Jordan Peterson, and he's just released a new book. I'm just getting into, and he talks um, a little bit about a genie in a bottle, and how that genie pops or genie in a lamp, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, let pop culture there. make me forget what the actual story is. Thank you, Britney Spears, or whoever that was. But a genie in a lamp, um, and it is not the genie that's just out there waving a magic wand and releasing wishes all over the place willy-nilly that creates that potent power of the genie. It's the fact that the genie is constrained, and then the genie is released and still constrained by these rules of, I'll grant you these three wishes. And then the instructive uh, tale about how most people waste those three wishes because they're wishing for something and completely forgetting about the constraints of, this genie didn't exist before. Before it was just the lamp and the genie was tucked away. And the genie's going to get tucked away again after I make my three wishes. And uh, basically, the idea of, there's this yin yang balance between conservatism, this appreciation for our legacy and what has gone before and all of the lessons learned by ancestors and through history. And then there's this need for change and improvement, and he calls it creative force. And and you can't really be effective in harnessing and applying that creative force without an appreciation and really an admiration almost for the very structure that you plan on destroying to whatever extent to allow that creative process to happen. And and I think what is happening so often now is the idea that I just want to create, here's my idea of utopia, or here's my sliver of utopia that I want to apply to society. And it's this idea of an armchair quarterback sitting and saying, there ought to be a law. There ought to be a law. Why don't they make that illegal? Why don't they force people to do this or that? Because that would make everything better, obviously. And it's like, well, and just like what you said, David, because we have this funny little anachronistic document that we all agreed in the first place to abide by, and we can't throw that out. It's very early on in the pandemic. It was the idea of, isn't it common sense? Isn't there have you heard this concept before, David, of the worst time to change your strategy or to try and reinvent the wheel is during an emergency.
Yeah.
Like you may get to the end of the emergency and say, wow, we could tweak some things, and the next time that sort of emergency comes up, we could fare better, or we could navigate that process a little more accurately, a little more successfully. But the last thing you do when you come up with an emergency or you get in an emergent situation is to start inventing what your strategy is, or to deciding what you're going to do. I mean, I think
And
Len would,
abandon any age-old wisdom.
yeah, you get into the thick of it, and like in Len's profession, you go back and you rely on your training. Just, whatever, and maybe the training needs to be modified or improved in the future, but in the middle of the situation, in the middle of the problem and the emergency, is not the time to start debating and rearranging what the strategy should be or what the rules should be. And I think we've been making up this COVID mitigation strategy as we've gone along. And I mean, I was happy to tolerate that for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks when it truly was a complete unknown, maybe potentially unprecedented, but boy, it's been a year, and I, yeah. Anyway, great conversation.
Yeah, really, really nice to talk with Len. I was just thinking that maybe we could do a bit of a review if there were comments here from people at Facebook. Currently there are no.
There's about 1,000 comments, David.
Is there? I hadn't looked.
Wow. Yeah,
There
that
were
is a.
no comments or questions at locals.com, so I can ignore that. But gosh,
I
were
feel
there any
some
that caught your eye?
responsibility to our viewing public here to.
Trying to
I
remember how
think
to.
we could take some time off air and review some of these, and we really appreciate all the conversation that happened in the background there. Grateful to all of those of you that have been watching and engaged with us. We'll do that. We'll take some time to review that, and maybe that will spark another episode. We
Yeah.
do episodes where it's just David and I in conversation. Maybe we could distill and some of that sentiment and have that discussion. But yeah,
So,
it's been a real pleasure.
yeah, it has been. And let's wrap up here. Fundamentalfreedoms.org is a website that Steve and I have produced recently. I just can't say enough about some of the articles that Steve have been writing and publishing there. Please check that out. And this video will be at Rumble and YouTube in the near future. Please like and subscribe and all the good stuff. And thanks for being here. Steve, it's been really great to talk with you again. We haven't done this in a few weeks, so it's been nice to get back in the saddle, so to speak.
Yes.
Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, David, and thank all of you.